Hello, welcome to our next Surviving Work conversation, and today we're going to be looking at precarious work. So we're going to be thinking about how work is structured, different types of employment relationship in health and social care. And to help me with this conversation is Roger Kline. Roger, tell us just a little bit about your work, your experience of working with precarious workers, and what brought you into this work.
I've worked for 8 trade unions over 25 years, and I've watched how the numbers of people employed in what I think is precarious work have changed, both in terms of numbers and also the sort of employment that they are involved in. And it's clearly now a major challenge, not just for trade unions, but for health service, social care. So a lot of my experience comes from that. And secondly, I've been involved a lot with work around bullying, whistleblowing and race discrimination in the health service. And one of the problems there is if people are insecure, they may feel, and they probably are, more vulnerable in some respects.
Yeah. So we're friends, but I don't know if you know what my background is, so I'll tell you a bit about
Tell me about your background.
Tell me about me. Well, my background's, like you, is in trades unions, but quite a sort of strange job. That I work mainly for a global trades union in the mining and extractive industries. And I was head of education, so my background's in workers' education and campaigning in different parts of the world, mainly developing countries. But then I came back to the UK about 7 years ago, and I started training here at the Tavistock Clinic as a psychotherapist. And I've always been very interested in this link between precarious work and precarious states of mind. So I think partly because I'm quite a thin-skinned, quite a sensitive person, I wasn't very good in politics. You have to be kind of much tougher than I was. But I was always very dissatisfied with how kind of emotions and states of mind were dealt with in trade unions. So anyway, I started working as an honorary psychotherapist in the NHS, and it was kind of, it was really painful to work with such brilliant people, you know, who are delivering really great work, and nobody's got any sense at all about, you know, earning a living and conditions, and really struggling with how to protect yourself at work, and also sort of people put in management positions who really weren't given any support or any guidance on how to do it. So the sort of my ways of thinking about precarious work are both on a kind of employment relations, trades union perspective, but also what precarity does to us as workers in mental health. So, and the other thing that happened to me was that just in the middle of my training, to become a psychotherapist, I was put in a compulsory redundancy pool by my employer, which is in higher education, which is how I started working, building up surviving work. And one of the experiences that I had, which I think is quite common for trades unionists, which is that it's one thing to protect other people. I'd spent my whole life representing others, but actually I found that there were moments where I really thought, I don't know anything about sticking up for myself. So it was kind of devastating, but it also led me through a sort of sharp learning curve about how to really deal with the emotions around working life. So that's where we are. Now, let's just think about this term precarious work, because that's in employment relations, that's a very sexy term, isn't it? And there was a very important book written by Guy Standing called The Precariat, the dangerous new underclass, which caught a lot of people's attention and triggered a lot of research about the increase in precarity in working life. Now, I want you to have a go at defining what you think precarious work is, and then I'll have a go.
Well, I think there's work that is more formally and easily described as being precarious. So if you are an agency worker, if you are a temporary worker, if you are a subcontractor doing work that 20 years ago was likely to not be subcontracted, you both have less employment rights and more likelihood in particular, of not being able to keep the same job.
Yeah.
But there are other people, I think, who would think their jobs are quite precarious too. So, for example, in the NHS, the average employment tenure of chief executives is a little over 2 years. There's a great army of what are called interim managers, who are basically people who've been made redundant after doing jobs at middling or higher seniority in the NHS, and are now employed on a variety of contracts. Sometimes that can pay well, but actually you never know next month where you're going to be. I think the final group is that there are people in certain types of organisations, probably in certain types of occupations, where, for example, when the NHS went through a period of lots of mergers, restructuring of primary care, merging of community trust with acute trust, lots of people were fearful for their consequences, even though probably most of them were always going to be employed. So that creates a climate where people are nervous about challenging and doing the right thing, even though on average most of them will still be in work at the end of the process.
Yeah. It's really interesting because in mental health we've got quite sort of like stark changes taking place because of this decommissioning or decentralisation of commissioning powers. So it's quite sort of chaotic at the moment about where the money is, where the jobs are. It's also a real kind of sudden movement of contractors and agencies, private contractors and agencies being able to tender for services and bid for services. And one of the sort of consequences of things not being clear is that people do feel more insecure about their positions. So there's been, probably since about 2013, that when services were decommissioned, that people started to be unsure of who was making the financial decisions, what money was available.
Yeah.
And you started to see people really undercut each other in terms of how much services were going to be cut. So sort of public sector organisations suddenly going, well, we've just got to halve the amount that we're charging. And that created a lot of insecurity for people. The other thing that happened, I think, in mental health was that maybe connected to this process of privatisation, essentially, was the downgrading of certain clinical services. So in IAPT, for example, the main modality is psychological well-being. So counsellors or therapists became psychological well-being practitioners. Now, at the moment, these are the same people, the people that have been trained. But actually, the profession has been downgraded, which means that more private sector organisations can start to tender for the services. So there are clusters of very high levels of insecurity in health and social care, particularly around restructuring and downgrading professions.
In the NHS, I mean, there are particular occupational groups. So a lot of overseas doctors who probably should be working at consultant level are employed as associate specialists, often doing the work of consultants, but on much less pay, much more insecure conditions, and no prospects of career advancement. Around London, there's significant numbers of people who have chosen to be more precariously employed because they probably feel, first of all, they may be able to earn more in the short term, and it gives them a degree of choice. If they are people who feel, actually, I'm being bullied here, I'm being discriminated against here, if I become an agency worker, I don't have to pay the NHS pension. I am paid more per hour than I would be. If I'm treated badly because I am Filipino or black, I can go elsewhere. It's less likely that people will pick up if I'm doing extra hours above the working time directive. The problem, of course, is if they become ill or they become old,
Yeah.
they're seriously worse off. So the reason that organisations will pay more is because they don't carry the long-term risks of them becoming sick or retiring with a pension. So there is a layer of people, and it's quite a lot,
Yeah.
who decided to make a short-term judgment rather than the long-term one.
Yeah, and you see that in psychotherapy, of people being unable or unwilling to navigate the NHS system, so they're going into private practice, essentially doing the same work. Some of them doing okay, others less so. We don't know actually how many sort of individual private practices or social enterprises are actually making money. But there are a level of insecurities in the literature. Having more precarious work forms leads to, it's not just about money or job security, because it tends to be more flexible work. It's also things like skills degradation.
Yep.
So if you're working for an agency, very, very low chances, not impossible, but low chances of actually having your skills replenished, which in certain sort of health and social care sectors, that gives you about 5 years before your skills really become quite defunct within the system.
And that's going to be an issue that's going to be picked up by the revalidation process, particularly for nurses, because nurses who are working in agency are not going to do anything more than have the minimal upgrading, because their agency on the whole is not going to pay for them to do anything other than the minimal kind of upgrading. So there is an issue, which I'm not sure has been thought about enough, about whether or not agency staff are going to be disproportionately disadvantaged by revalidation. Now, it may be that one of the consequences of that is it obliges agencies to provide more training. But I think the short-term effect is going to be that more agency people are going to be failed on revalidation. And whereas there's a rich database around gender and ethnicity for employed staff in the health service, the same data is not available for casually, temporarily agency or contract workers. But my sense is that certainly in nursing, a disproportionate number of agency workers are probably from black and minority ethnic backgrounds.
It's really interesting about the confusion and the lack of data on this. Coming from the mining sector, where sort of contract and agency labour is like the key health and safety issue, and there's huge amounts of regulation and development around it. Seeing it in particularly in mental health, for example, is terrifying, because the literature says that one of the key risks around using contract or agency labour is the kind of relationships, the casual relationships that are no longer formed. So there's critical incidents around handover of shifts. People tend not to talk to the agency nurse in the same way that they would talk to a long-standing colleague. This patient has this problem, this piece of equipment is playing up here. So there's the knowledge, much less knowledge gets transferred during shift handover periods, which presumably is going to have an impact on patient care, on accidents, all manner of stuff. But because the NHS doesn't keep data on that, it's only very recently, the end of last year, that they even collected data on bank staff, which is the internal labour agency. We don't really know what's happening with the interlap between permanent direct employment and contract and agency labour.
One of the interesting things about agency staff in the NHS is they're not necessarily people are here today and gone tomorrow.
No.
So community nursing, district nursing and health visiting, I know there are agency staff who for many months have been employed in the same post because you just can't get district nurses and health visitors in some places.
Yeah.
And they do then become part of the teams. But you're right. I think particularly in hospitals, it's more of a risk. I don't know what the data shows, but I suspect it shows. And one of the consequences of the NHS announcing it's going to cap what's happening with agency costs is I suspect they're going to have to start collecting more data. And it'll be really interesting, because one of the things you might want to map then is rates of agency staff against, for example, critical incidents?
Yeah, absolutely.
As I don't know, but intuition suggests there's a connection.
I thought it was amazing because, of course, recently Simon Stevens has waged war on agencies, private employment agencies, ripping off the NHS. We even had Jeremy Hunt saying that it was costing too much money. And, you know, that's a really interesting move. Of course, what's terrifying is that we really don't know how much this is costing because no one's collecting this information.
And what's worse is people like the King's Fund are sceptical about whether the NHS can actually do it because it's become so dependent. I think they are determined to drive it down, drive the costs down. But the reason it's there is not largely because people want to work agency. It's because there aren't enough staff permanently employed. The NHS has failed to make work sufficiently attractive that for some people it makes sense to go as agency or to leave altogether. And in particular professions, there are real shortages. So simply saying when we're going to cut out precarious working might hit the buffers when a chief executive says, well, never mind that. We're way over the 4-hour barrier, the 4-hour limit in A&E. Get some staff in. So I think it is quite a challenge, I think.
It is, and then if you look at a sector like social care, particularly domiciliary care workers, so the Resolution Foundation has done some amazing research on this, not just in terms of wages, so the really startling statistic, 160,000 social carers in this country are earning less than the minimum wage, bad enough, but 80% of the people currently working in social care now are women who are 45 plus, who will retire early because they're knackered and the money doesn't pay them enough to carry on long term. And there's going to be a real crisis in terms of attracting people on a permanent basis into this profession, which it is.
Well, in social care, of course, it's compounded. It's not just the pay levels, it's the extent of 0 hours contracts, and it's the way in which you're not paid for a lot of your time because you may well not be paid. For example, when you're travelling between jobs, even though the only reason you're travelling between jobs is to get from one piece of work to another. The same work 20 years ago, you were paid for all the time you were doing, including your time travelling between work. So I think social care is a little different in some respects. Because the pay is so low, the skills are so under valued, and yet everybody knows actually the skills required if you're a good care worker are much, much higher than what you're being paid for.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very moving when you see social carers at work. I mean, it's a phenomenal emotional job. And it's not, I mean, in a way, it's never been recognised in our society, the value of that work. You know, this tends to be low-paid work. It's also linked to the fact that it tends to be women that are doing it. I suppose that's what really sort of strikes me, is how people can be working under such precarious work conditions, and to the point where I think a lot of us would really struggle not to go completely crazy. So there's a link, isn't there, between these insecure jobs and how you manage your states of mind. And it's a huge irony, isn't it? The people that are paid to deal with people's emotions, particularly anxiety, you know, if you're working as a social carer, you're often dealing with very anxious and distressed patients, that you're also having to cope with your own anxieties about how your work is structured. So
I think my view would be that the research suggests that that's not medium-term sustainable, because if employers can't demonstrate that to some degree they care for their staff, it is going to impact on the care that they provide. If you're not cared for, you are going to eventually, it's going to wear you down. And I mean, I think it will be as you know, as the conditions worsen probably rather than improve, So employers of the sector will find ways round the living wage in the same way as they found a way around, well, we won't pay you for your time travelling between work. There will be other ways of reducing the impact of that. And the sector in social care is already saying we cannot afford the living wage, and they're probably right on the contracts that councils are offering, because councils have been so battered by the Treasury.
Yeah.
So this is a real crisis, and it's going to get worse because the health sector increasingly is going to rely on social care, enabling them to move the most expensive cost in the health sector, the care of the elderly, more into the community.
Yeah.
So it's a perfect storm. The NHS becomes increasingly reliant on finding ways of either preventing people coming into hospital or safely moving out. But social care is increasingly underfunded to be able to do that. And the staff in there are not cared for and increasingly will be de-skilled, because one of the consequences for social care people is it's the same as for nurses. Your agencies provide some level. They provide the minimal statutory updating, but they don't provide the developmental stuff that really makes you be on top of developments and so on.
Yeah. Now this has just got me thinking, because in the employment relations literature, another term for precarious work or contract and agency work is externalisation. Sometimes they call it triangulation. So instead of the old model where you have employer-employee, it's a binary relationship. Now with the advent of contractors and agencies, you've got a third party involved, so triangle, where in the case of an agency, the worker is employed by the agency that provides services to the NHS, let's say. And there's a question over what happens to employers' responsibilities, but also clinical responsibilities, duty of care, with that triangulation. Because it feels, when you're a worker, an agency worker, often it's very unclear who is responsible for what. In mental health, often that's a really very dangerous confusion about clinical responsibility, for example, for a patient that's suicidal, in a context where duty of care isn't clear.
See, I think the situation is probably very clear, but it is muddied. It's very clear because whatever your employment status, if you're providing the care, you have the duty of care. Now that may be if you are, that will depend on how work is delegated. It won't, strictly speaking, depend on your employment status, but people often think it does. And the more you have people going in and out, if you like, episodically providing care, there's the issue of, so who has the continuing responsibility? Well, actually, it will be the organisation that's providing the care, but that doesn't mean that, for example, agency workers don't have a duty of care. So if you are a agency district nurse, your duty of care to your patients is exactly the same as the duty of care of an employed district nurse.
Okay.
The question is, where does the agency fit in that? And that's less clear. And I think one of the things we will see is, if the current levels of agency working are sustained, is that the health service in particular will want to be much clearer about where responsibilities lie. So, for example, the duty of candour. The duty of candour will apply just as much to agency workers as it does to employed staff. Does it apply as much to agency managers? I'm not so sure. I think it should. Fit and proper persons test, which is going to apply to directors and senior managers in the NHS. Does that apply to contractors? I think the answer is it does apply if you are Virgin Care or Serco and you're directly providing the services, it will. If you're an agency, it may not be so clear, particularly if the people you're providing are nominally self-employed, as some of them will be.
Gosh.
So, but the principles, I think the NHS will increasingly want to make clear, apply to whoever you are, whatever your contract, you are covered by the obligations and responsibilities of the duty of care. Whether the agencies and contractors have may not be so clear. Certainly direct providers who are covered by the NHS contract are covered. They will be subject to some of those fit and proper persons tests, duty of candour, etc. There'll be an expectation that their staff are. I think the position of agencies is less clear, particularly if there's a web of companies.
Yeah. Okay. Now, there are no magic solutions. Both of us come from a trade union movement, which does not offer magic solutions, unfortunately. But how can somebody who's in insecure work start to protect themselves and build up some kind of support within their workplace?
I think there's no magic answers. In a way, the easier way is to respond collectively. And there are pockets of places where trade union organisation or other ways of doing things will make sure that at least the minimal legal rights of staff are respected. People don't realise that temporary workers, agency workers, part-time workers do have some legal rights, especially around issues like discrimination. What they don't have is tenure of employment, and they may well have very grey employment contract rights. In some cases, they may have very similar contracts of employment to employed workers, but in many cases, they'll be less well paid, they'll be vaguer. One of the best points of starting is probably to be clear about what your professional duties and rights are. So you are required to provide the same level of care if you're a registered nurse, whether or not you're an agency or a temporary or a subcontract or working on the bank nurse. And your employer will or should know that. And that may be one way of saying, actually, this workload is too big to be safe, or that protocol I haven't been trained in, or these handovers are too flimsy to be safe, or actually I'm being asked to do stuff here that I don't believe I'm competent to do, or indeed, some agency workers, I'm being asked to delegate stuff to people that I'm not confident are competent to do it. Now that stuff will apply. And I think increasingly in the health service, at least, agencies will not want to get a reputation of providing workers who are regularly breaching their duty of care, because the cost to the organisation is going to become more serious in the wake of Francis and some of the tightening up of regulations and the increased emphasis on the duty of care.
So maybe that's part of it.
That's one part of it.
Which is really taking a professional approach, so knowing what the professional standards are, using professional bodies or the bodies that are there to explain the legal duties of care, for example, so that you can use that as part of your argument. However,
that won't prevent an agency from saying this person is just causing the employers we're sending her to grief. We're going to give her less work. We're going to send her to work that's less well paid, where she won't be asked to do these things. The rights not to be discriminated against, or the right to whistleblow, apply in whatever employment context you are. But exercising them is much more difficult if your work is precarious. It's hard enough to raise concerns without it being rather easier for the employer to simply move you on. So I think as individuals, so collectively, It may be possible to respond to this. Some places through trade unions, it may in other cases just be collectively doing things. There are some initiatives around that. But individually, what should you do? Well, you should find people you can talk to about it. You should try and keep an audit trail if you're being asked to do unsafe things, particularly if you're being asked to do unsafe things and you're placing on the record your concerns. That may provide you with some protection, and learning how to be quietly assertive or resilient.
Yeah.
So you know when it's appropriate to raise things, what policies and procedures might be helpful. Don't assume you have legal rights just because you've read in the papers about a case where somebody won something for raises some concerns. So understand the policies, understand the procedure, take advice, and you have to learn not to pick every fight.
Yeah.
You have to pick and choose when you want to make a stand. Sometimes it may be the appropriate thing is to move on and perhaps tell the CQC as you move on, because it may not be safe to raise it while you're there.
Yeah.
So you do have to be cautious, but keeping an audit trail, find people to talk to, take some advice. If it is possible to do things collectively, it's much safer.
Yeah. I'm going to reflect back to you what you've just said, but thinking about it on an emotional level, because another terminology that we use in this country for precarious work is vulnerable work. And of course, that's the pain of this, isn't it? That when you're precarious, you feel the vulnerability, and that's why it makes it so very hard to sort of find a solution to these problems. So the first thing about writing a record, I think, is works on an emotional level as well. Of course, if you're ever going to make it formal, yes, of course, you need to be able to say it, and it's on an emotional level, it's a very hard thing to do. I know a lot of people, of course, who are being bullied and victimised at work, and you say, look, you've got to write it down. We all know that you're supposed to write it down, so why is it so painful to do? Because when you're writing it down, you're admitting that you have a problem, that there's something that's happening that you wish wasn't happening. So it's a very painful exercise, but emotionally, it's the first step. Because most of us coast along, ducking and diving, not wanting to really admit to what's going on, that we have a problem. So writing it down is an important part of admitting there's a problem, and also regaining your your perspective, because that's another thing that goes when you're frightened, which precarious workers are, is your sense of being able to trust your own feelings, being able to stand your ground, to be able to defend yourself. So writing it down is part of that process of being able to say, this is what I think is happening in my work. The second thing you said, which is about collectivizing, on an emotional level, it's essential to tell somebody and to have support, whether it's in work, outside work, hopefully a mixture of the two. And that's not to say that the people that always help us are the ones that we like or the ones that we love, but they might just be people who are solid, who are trustworthy, who are witnesses to our experience at work. So selection of people is very, very important. One of the problems for precarious workers is, how do you know when to trust somebody? Because, people generally want to be nice and they want to be helpful. But if you ever get into conflict in work, then it's very hard to maintain those relationships. And a lot of people do actually walk away. So I think it's not just about forming relationships. You need allies, but also really trying to maintain those relationships when the situation has become more conflictual.
I think I agree with that, but I think that if people are given some support on how to write down, so I use a little template which says what, when, and what evidence is there for it. In terms of policy, process, witness, emails, etc. And what you will find is, someone's given a bit of advice, what that enables them to do is to move beyond describing how bad things are to getting some understanding of how they might be able to influence the situation. Because what you find is, if you're vulnerable, you can never, it is difficult to move beyond describing how bad it is. Whereas what writing down can do, especially if you've got someone support you, is help you understand what's happening to you.
Yeah.
And maybe understanding, actually, this will be a really useful thing to push on. That's a waste of time. So you actually start to, and the moment on which your confidence grows is the point at which you feel you're starting to influence the situation. It's a little bit like the old trade union thing, where if you were trying to unionize somewhere, it wouldn't actually matter what you're winning. It could be extremely insignificant. The important thing was to demonstrate you could win.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think for individuals, sometimes very small things can be very important in terms of your self-respect and sometimes how you're seen by other people and demonstrated to other people. Actually, it is possible to stop some of this.
Because it's one of the things that I really miss and appreciate about trade union wins is that often the wins are very small, but they're significant because they bring you back out of this catastrophic world where, you know, everybody's against you and you're too small to stand a chance to win anything, where something can be done. We might not be able to win all of it, but something's better than nothing.
And the other thing, you never know when you challenge these things. Depends on the employer, but you never know when you challenge, if you win, what's then said to the person who's been bullying you. So I always remember a case where I advised someone on a case of race discrimination in a fitness centre, and we knew that the same thing had happened to other people. This was the first person to challenge it. We went to a tribunal. The tribunal was stopped before it started because the company eventually made 4 offers. The person who had taken the case didn't want to accept the offer. And I said, I am certain that this person will be gone within 6 months because she's cost the company money. It's embarrassing that it's race discrimination. They have a lot of black customers. This person will either be moved or will be gone. And 7 months later, they were moved. They were sacked, actually. Not directly as a result of this, but because the company made a judgment that actually we don't want this sort of stuff. Not because out of the goodness of their heart, because it's bad business to be seen to be discriminating, and it cost them money.
I've got one final question, which is what keeps you working in this field?
Values. From my parents, really. And the satisfaction of, I think like a lot of people who work for trade unions and a lot of people who do all sorts of other voluntary work and a lot of people who work in health service and social care, we get a lot of satisfaction from helping people. So this is a particular type of helping people. It can be incredibly rewarding to see people change for the better and to see injustice stopped.
Yeah. As someone who works from my side, someone who works in mental health, often you're wrestling with real feelings of despair and hopelessness, and sort of in a climate of the NHS being in the state it's in. A lot of public sector workers feel really depressed about their working life, and yet every single time I'm in an institution and in contact with clinicians and patients, I'm so moved by what a little bit of human contact can do for all of us, both Absolutely. The clinician and the patient. So I suppose I forget very easily sometimes how easy it is to just rehumanise and to feel like a human being in an imperfect system.
But that's one of the things you see, isn't it?
Yeah.
You see people, they get a different manager, they become a different person.
Yeah. Let's hope. Roger Kline, thank you very much.